Hello, all, and welcome. We are going to give people just a moment to hop on. We are excited to see some names of people we recognize, but I also know that we have people from all over the country joining us this evening, so that is exciting. So particularly welcome to those people who are not in the New York City area. We are so excited to have you joining us. We're going to give people about another minute to hop on, and then we will go ahead and get started this evening. It's good to see all of the names, even though we can't see the faces, to see the names of people that we haven't been able to see in person. We're very excited to have you all join us.
Yeah, I just wish I could see you. Kind of unnerving that you can see me and I can't see you.
It is a little bit unnerving sometimes. But hopefully everyone is out there smiling. And we will go ahead and get started. And as people join us, they will just pop on. Oh, Glenda, thank you.
Hi, Mark. Hi, Glenda.
Awesome. I'm Jamie Staley, and I'm the Director of Christian Education at Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church. And again, I want to welcome all of you, particularly those who we haven't had a chance to meet in person yet. As I was going through the invitations, all of the recipients, I noticed that there are so many people who are from outside of the New York City area. So thank you for joining us. It is really great to meet you virtually, and hopefully we will get to meet you in person at some point. So I want to welcome you to our annual CREDO series. This is a series where we look at essentials of Christian theology. And this year we are taking a dip into the four Gospels. This evening, we are going to begin with the Gospel according to Mark, which you may note is not the first Gospel listed in the Bible, but our teacher this evening, Morgan, will tell us more about that. Morgan Valencia King is the Director of Engagement at Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church. He holds his master's in divinity from Princeton Seminary, and he is most likely to be the first face you see when you join us in person at Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church. So thank you, Morgan, for joining us this evening, and take it away. Tell us about Mark.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you especially for asking me to lead Credo on the same day that I was also preaching. It's really just made it such a lovely weekend. So thank you for that perfect timing. No, I actually asked Jamie if she would let me lead Mark. If it's okay, I don't know if this is actually okay to say, but if you can particularly love one of the gospel accounts, I particularly love Mark. So I'm glad that Jamie indulged me and allowed me to speak about the Gospel of Mark. So let's just jump in. Hopefully you all can see that, because I'm not great with technology. But I want to start tonight's discussion in the same way that my professor, Dr. Clifton Black, started his course on the Gospel of Mark. And I remember it so clearly because he repeated it over and over and over. So I do think it's a good place to start. And that just has to do with how we refer to this gospel account. Dr. Black would always say, we shouldn't call it Mark's gospel. We shouldn't call it the Gospel of Mark. And that is because in reality, as people of faith, particularly as Christians, we believe that this is the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so we should really think about this as the gospel of Jesus Christ according to Mark. And in some ways that may sound like semantics, but I do think it's important because it really kind of anchors us. It reminds us why this matters, why it's important, because we are people who profess our faith, not in Mark, but in Jesus Christ. So that being said, Mark, I think, has a particular flavor. There's a little bit of an intensity that I think Mark has compared to the other Gospels. it seems that Mark expects you as you read along to keep up. And we see this in a lot of the language and the way that it's laid out. A couple examples. In this relatively short text, the word "and" occurs 1,078 times. And obviously that is a word that each of us use frequently and over, but I doubt that in the next 30 or 40 minutes, I will use it 1,078 times. And so that's notable. And when you're reading it, there's the sense of, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and then this happened, and then they went there. And so there's kind of, there's a lot of action. It's jam-packed with action. Along the same lines, the words "immediately" occurs no less than 42 times. So if you're not hearing "and," it's immediately this happened, immediately this happened. And sometimes both of them together, and you'll get an "and immediately this happened." So there's just kind of a sense of urgency. Mark has a high energy. So Mark is the shortest, and it's also the oldest. So I am assuming that's why Jamie wanted us to start with Mark, is because it is considered to be the oldest gospel account. This means that the words in Mark would have been written closest to the time of the actual events that they depict. Mark, it's important to know, as the oldest gospel, would not have had access to the other three, to Luke or to Matthew or to John. And so what's in Mark wouldn't have been influenced by them, or Mark wouldn't have had any kind of desire to corroborate what he was saying with the other three accounts as the first one. So if Mark isn't reading the other three gospels, what are his sources? Where exactly is Mark getting his information for his side of the story? So this is new to me, doing a presentation like this, and something that I learned, I guess, as a good millennial, is a great first starting place is YouTube. But YouTube and sources like that cannot stand alone, because one of the things I noticed in a lot of the clips I saw was that there's this tradition, or there's this theory, that Mark was familiar with Peter, that Mark and Peter were colleagues, and that a lot of the content in Mark would have come directly from Peter, one of the disciples, of course. Most of the commentary, most of the scholarly sources I read said that is definitely not true. They said that Mark would not be an eyewitness, and likely didn't even get his account from an eyewitness or from someone who was there. So in some ways, you might think, okay, so if Mark isn't talking to somebody, if Mark wasn't there, and if Mark also isn't talking to somebody who was there, should we be concerned? Does this give us pause about the validity of Mark's side of the story? I don't think so. The materials most readily available to Mark when writing his gospel when writing his account of Christ's gospel, would have come through the experienced faith of the community of Christians at the time. So there would have been an oral tradition of preaching, of teaching, of conversation, of debate, all around the man that we call Jesus. And so I think this is actually great. In a lot of ways, when we think about that witness as Mark's primary source, there's kind of a sense of discipleship. There's a handing down of testimonies of God, of even the communion of saints in Mark's words. And so Mark wouldn't have had access to a lot of this information if it weren't for the witness of his community at the time. Okay, so we've talked about we've talked about how Mark would not have been aware of the other three gospels. On the other hand, Mark would have likely been a source for at least Luke and Matthew. So I have this graphic that I found, and I think it's pretty helpful. Relationships between the Synoptic Gospels. So if you're not familiar with the word synoptic, if you don't know what that means, that's okay. It means that you're actually normal. If you do know the word, or if you need a rehash, it basically just means we're talking about Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And the reason for that is scholarly research suggests that the three of these gospels actually shared a lot of the same traditions and a lot of the same stories and a lot of the content. So if we look at the top little bubble right here, the top circle with Mark, you can see that 76% of Mark actually occurs in Luke and Matthew as well. So 41% of Luke is the same as Mark, and 46% of Matthew. Just to look at a little bit more of the breakdown, 3% of Mark is in Mark and in Luke, and then 18% of Mark is also in Matthew. So this is significant because that means that 97% of the gospel of Jesus Christ, according to Mark, also shows up in either Luke or Matthew or both. That leaves us with only 3% of unique content. That's not very much. So Mark would have likely been a source or something that Luke and Matthew were familiar with as later gospels. And so that's important over the next couple of weeks when you learn about those accounts to see how the gospel tradition develops with Mark as a source. So let's talk a little bit about the context of Mark. Consensus is that Mark would have been written around 60 CE and certainly no later than 80, CE just meaning Common Era, or just another way to say AD. Commentary suggests that whoever wrote Mark had a limited knowledge of Judaism and was likely a Gentile, meaning that the person was coming from a non-Jewish background. Scholars cannot ascertain for certain where Mark was written, but they discredit the tradition that says that Mark was written in Rome. So this goes back to what I said earlier about whether Mark knew Peter and Mark was a colleague of Peter's in Rome. That's likely not the case. And one of the ways that we know that, or that we can guess that that's not true, is because the content in Mark doesn't appear to be particularly familiar with Paul's writings or his terminology, which would have come before when Mark was writing, and if he were in Rome, would have likely been available to him. Mark, commentators suggest, is also fairly unsophisticated. This shows up in some ways in the writing. I already mentioned this with the frequency of and the immediatelys and the abruptness of the account. It's not considered beautiful writing. And then also in the content of its theology. So we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but basically Mark doesn't have some of those longer theological discourses and discussion that we see in the other three accounts. All right, so now that we've covered a bit of the background and the historical context of Mark, I wanted to spend just a little bit of time looking at some themes and some ideas that are unique or at least worthwhile to keep in mind while you're reading this account. So I'm hoping that all of you are going to go home after this, or you're actually already at home. You're going to move from your couch and pick up your Bible and read this. It's not very long. Even for slow readers, you could probably finish the whole gospel account in about 2 hours. So these are just things that I want you to think about when you're reading it. All right, so the world of Mark. When I think about Mark, I think that the text throws us in a lot of ways into a world that, if we're really thinking about it, is really unfamiliar to us. When I think about this and when I think about Mark, I remember something that my preaching professor would say in class, and she would say, don't say this or don't do this thing as part of your sermon. And that was, don't say, if we really think about it, this morning's scripture, the lives and the world of this morning's scripture aren't so different from our own. My preaching professor said, don't do that, because that's just not true, because it was an entirely different world. The way that living looks now is very different from the way that people lived their lives then. And I think that that is particularly evident in Mark. Why? So when you're thinking about what actually happens in Mark, I would say, and this is off the top of my head, Jesus probably spends 30 to 40% of his time casting out demons. I'd like to know the last time you cast out a demon or the last time you saw somebody cast out a demon. It's not super frequent. And yet that is a significant part of what's going on in Mark. The demons, for the audience at the time, they would have thought that this was a real physical, spiritual manifestation of Satan against the work of Jesus. So what else do we see? We see Jesus constantly healing the sick. I think this is for several reasons, but not least of which would have been that sickness in the ancient world was a major problem. Sickness would have been a major problem in a way that for many of us might feel unfamiliar or is foreign because of the advances of modern medicine, pandemics aside. The prevalence of sickness made it common knowledge that any type of savior or a Messiah would have come to save the people from illness. In a very real way, what we see in Mark is that the people were desperate to be saved from many things, but particularly from sickness. So another thing to watch for while you're reading the gospel, pay careful attention to the crowd. Watch how the crowd is portrayed. In some scenes, they chase after Jesus. In other scenes, Jesus is running away from them. They keep others from Jesus. People who want to get to Jesus can't because of the crowd. They throw Jesus out. They reject Jesus. And then in other moments, they testify about Jesus. To me, the crowd is probably one of the most interesting and confusing parts of the narrative, but I would definitely keep your eye on them. So I also just wanted to say a quick word about the discipleship, the depiction of discipleship that we see in Mark's version of the events. So I kind of mentioned that with the rhythm and the ands and the immediatelys, there's an emphasis on action. And we also see that in discipleship. So in Mark in particular, I think there's an importance on not just knowing about Jesus, but actively following him. So we see this, like I said, in the pace of the action, but also in the lack of extended theological discourse. Mark doesn't have as many of those as you'll find in the other gospel accounts. And then beyond all of that, I think we also get an interesting look at discipleship in the depiction of Jesus's disciples, who kind of never really quite get it. It's like they don't really understand, at least not fully at first, what's happening. And something we're going to talk about later is who does understand and who doesn't understand. But the disciples in Mark's text in particular just kind of stumble around in this metaphorical darkness. So something I have to talk about when we're discussing Mark is this idea of the Messianic Secret. So in Mark, we're going to see a lot of moments of divine power. A lot of miraculous things happen. And frequently, these are bookended with Jesus telling everyone who was there to be quiet, to not say anything. One of the strangest parts of Mark to me is this tension between revelation and secrecy. So let's take a look. Some of Jesus's first words are to silence the demons who know immediately who Jesus is, and they know why he's come. This is particularly interesting as well when, like I said, Christ's disciples never get it, and his own family actually think that Jesus is losing his mind. Throughout Mark, there's also a sense of the gospel as private knowledge. So let's look at Mark 4:33 through 34. And this comes at one of the account's only theological discourses. It says, "He did not speak to them, the crowd, except in parables, but he explained everything in private to his disciples." So in other words, understanding is given to some and to not others. And even among those who possess knowledge, some have more and some have less. So Jesus is speaking to the crowd. He's giving them knowledge, but not all of the knowledge. And he's not doing it in a way that they intuitively understand. And then Jesus gives more of that knowledge to the disciples, but ironically, they're still in the dark. Okay, so before we move on, I just want to linger for a moment about some of the stranger, unique content. So I want to just talk a little bit about that 3%. There's the secrecy that I've already mentioned, but Mark is just in some ways kind of an unedited, I would say, look at the ministry of Christ. So Mark is the only account that contains reference to a young man who followed Jesus after the disciples fled at his arrest. Apparently, he was only wearing a loincloth, and when they tried to seize him, he ran away naked. The text gives no explanation to this odd inclusion, but some have theorized that this man was the author of Mark, or at least that this figure represented the author of Mark. A few other things unique to Mark. So this is the only account where Jesus specifically instructs the disciples to cast out demons as part of their ministry. So this goes back to, what is Jesus doing? What does the gospel look like? And here it looks like casting out demons and healing the sick. The gospel, according to Mark, is also the only one that refers to Jesus as the son of Mary and makes references to his sisters. It's the only one that says that Jesus specifically is a carpenter, not just his father. And perhaps most significantly, Mark is the only account with significant discrepancy in endings across manuscripts. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later. Okay, so in Mark, we find many passages that refer to healing, to demonic possession, and to silence, whether kept or not, of those around Jesus. I want to spend a few minutes looking at some examples of this. And I've asked for Jamie at this point to feel free to pipe up just to keep things interesting. And I'd also invite any of you to share your own observations in the chat as I read these scriptures. Okay. So again, feel free to share any reactions while I'm reading. This is the gospel according to Mark chapter 2, starting in verse 1. When he returned to Capernaum after some days, it was reported that he was at home. So many gathered around that there was no longer room for them, not even in the front of the door. And he was speaking the word to them. Then some people came, bringing to him a paralyzed man, carried by 4 of them. And when they could not bring him to Jesus because of the crowd, they removed the roof above him. And after having dug through it, they let down the mat on which the paralytic lay. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Now some of the scribes were sitting there, questioning in their hearts, "Why does this fellow speak in this way? It is blasphemy. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" At once, Jesus perceived in his spirit that they were discussing these questions among themselves. And he said to them, "Why do you raise such questions in your heart? Which is easier, to say to the paralytic, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Stand up and take your mat and walk'? But so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins," he said to the paralytic, "I say to you, stand up, take your mat, and go to your home." And he stood up and immediately took the mat and went out before all of them, so that they were all amazed and glorified God, saying, "We have never seen anything like this." This story of Jesus healing the paralytic occurs in Mark, Matthew, and Luke, all of the Synoptic Gospels. In Matthew, the story doesn't seem to be in a home. In Luke, it's fairly similar, and they do lower this man down into the crowd, but only in Mark does it specifically say that the friends actually tore the roof off of the building to get their friend to Jesus. So any reactions to this? Jamie, I don't see you.
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry, I turned off my video so that they could all see you. But my initial reaction was just looking for those things that you asked us to look for earlier.
So I'll share some of my thoughts because I can't see anything anyway.
I'm here.
Oh, Jamie, there you are.
Can you hear me?
Oh, I don't hear you.
Okay. And that might be, I wonder if
Hold on.
that's Morgan's. I wonder if that's Morgan's. Okay, it sounds like some people can hear me. So I'm going to go ahead and talk. They can hear me. So I'm going to go ahead and just share my reaction, which hopefully then Morgan can hear. I was just trying to do what Morgan had asked us to do earlier, which was to think about the crowd and to think about where the crowd was here. And they were causing some problems here. And then secondly,
I can hear you now.
Oh, good. Okay, Morgan, I was just saying, sorry about that. I was just saying that I tried to do what you asked us to do, which was to look at the crowd and to think about what the crowd was doing in this story. And they were hindering these people from coming through. And then secondly, my other thing that I noticed was at the end, Jesus appears to do this miracle and doesn't seem to tell them to keep it a secret, which is different than kind of what we see other places. Yeah. I was also just going to share a couple of things from the chat, aside from everyone saying they could hear me. Thank you, everyone. Francisco said, Morgan, you mentioned that the gospel according to Mark mentions Jesus's sisters. It said, I thought Jesus had at least a brother. Is there anything that you want to speak to that? And maybe we may want to leave that for a question at the end.
I think though, can you hear me? Okay. I think that what's special to Mark is that he mentions the sisters, not that he left out the brothers. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. Are there any, now that Morgan can hear me, are there any other observations? I can read them from the chat to him as well.
Okay, if not, I can go ahead and share some thoughts I have. So yes, the crowd, which in this case, he doesn't tell them to be silent. But I think what's interesting is the crowd in particular in this scene becomes larger than life. They really kind of take over the scene. The room is so crowded that ripping the roof off of a home becomes a viable option. That's a pretty big crowd. Certainly not COVID compliant. More about the crowd. The crowd here, and I think this is really interesting, serves specifically as a barrier. So the ones in the house with God, despite maybe they have good intentions, the ones in the house with God, or maybe the house of God, are the very thing that keeps those seeking Jesus from getting to him. That's convicting. I'm not even sure what to do with that. And it reminds me of an expression I've heard a lot, which is people saying, I like Jesus, but I don't like his followers. So another thing, this passage highlights the tension in Mark concerning those who possess the knowledge and those who don't. So there is, of course, those who are literally inside the house, and then there are those who are outside of the house. Of course, in this passage, it's actually those that are coming from the outside. It's those who were originally excluded from this moment in community that seem to fully understand and expect who Jesus is as a healer and as Savior. And of course, the religious authorities inside the house are shown to persist in their not knowing, even after Jesus forgives the paralytic of his sin and tells him to get up and walk. It's important to note, too, that the passage does not connect paralysis or disability with sin in any way, in case that's a question you have. So I think within this passage in particular, we see in Mark the surprising answer to the question of who possesses the knowledge, who understands who Jesus is, who does not. and even how for those already in the house of the Lord, we have to be comfortable with the collateral damage that might result when we open our space to others, when we make a path for other people to get to Jesus. They might rip the roof off. And I think we have to kind of be okay with it.
I like that. A couple other things, just so that you are aware, Morgan, from the chat. Thomas says, this scene has a lot of action, and it really does. Virginia says, I love that the healing becomes a collective thing between the friends of the paralytic involved as well. Yeah.
It's interesting that, verse 5 says, when Jesus saw their faith, the friends that brought this man to Jesus.
Glenn had a question. How is Capernaum considered his home? From verse 1, it said he was reported that he was at home. That's interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. I noticed that too. I guess off the top of my head, that's just where he was staying in Capernaum. I guess, I don't know.
I'm going to just go off the rails here and say that when I was in Israel, I visited Capernaum, and it says that it's Jesus's home as well. So yeah. I'm going to have to look that up. All right. Any other responses before we move on? Thank you, Nancy. He was working there also. Wonderful. Well, Wendy, wasn't Capernaum Peter's mother's home? You all are so helpful. Thank you for this. I'm taking notes. Thank you for this. Thank you for participating with us today.
Okay, let's look at another passage. So, Jamie, I've asked Jamie to read this one for us so that you don't get too tired of me.
All right. They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when he had stepped out of the boat, immediately a man out of the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. He lived among the tombs, and no one could restrain him anymore, even with a chain. For he had often been restrained with shackles and chains, but the chains he wrenched apart, and the shackles he broke in pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always howling and bruising himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and bowed down before him, and he shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he had said to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." He begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now there on the hillside, a great herd of swine was feeding, and the unclean spirits begged him, "Send us into the swine, let us enter them." So he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the swine, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and were drowned in the sea. The swineherds ran off and told it in the city and in the country. Then people came to see what it was that had happened. They came to Jesus and saw the demoniac sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, the very man who had had the legion, and they were afraid. Those who had seen what had happened to the demoniac and to the swine reported it. Then they began to beg Jesus to leave their neighborhood. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed by demons begged him that he might be with him. But Jesus refused and said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and what mercy he has shown you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed.
Thank you, Jamie. So just a quick second to look at this artwork that I found. Okay, so I imagine that in listening to this, especially if you're really paying attention, this story probably evokes a lot of different ideas and emotions. I think it's certainly a strange one. And one of the first things that I notice, especially in the context of some of Mark's other themes that we've already looked at, is how immediately the demons in this haunted individual recognize Jesus from the start, and they call him the Son of the Most High God. So are there any other observations or?
I'll tell you in the chat that Hannah noticed the word immediately.
Immediately and immediately.
And the idea of casting out the demons as well.
Yeah.
Wendy also mentioned the multiple demons again.
Mm-hmm.
Any other observations?
I'm struck by what looks like a golden retriever in the picture.
Susan asks, is this part of the 3% that is unique to Mark?
No. No, we'll talk a little bit more about what exactly is unique. But no, there's not, as far as I remember, any big stories or significant events that occur only in Mark. Okay. The 3%, well, we'll talk about that, but.
Hannah says, well, Jesus is doing his thing. No, you can't come with me. Stay and share the good news. And then Wendy says the same thing. This time, Jesus tells the demoniac to tell everyone what Jesus did for him.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good contrast to point out. I think it's also interesting in reacting to your reactions, Wendy and Hannah, is that this man wants to follow Jesus, which isn't that kind of a common refrain that we think of when we think of the gospel is, follow me. No, don't follow me, but tell everybody. And I think that's one of the reasons why I wanted to look at this passage, is just because it is one of the moments where Jesus doesn't say, don't tell anybody. So I do have a few things that I just wanted to share. So we've talked about this a little, but in Mark, over and over, and I'm going to repeat it, just like I feel like the gospel itself repeats it. There's this idea of who knows, who doesn't know, how much do they know, who do we expect to know? And in other Mark episodes, like we talked about, the demons are the first to know and the first to proclaim. Similarly, we have more of this insider-outsider theme, but here it's really taken to the extreme. So in the ancient context, the sea would have been representative of chaos and danger and the unknown. So to get to where this guy is, Jesus and the disciples literally cross the unknown. They cross chaos and danger. And of course, once they've done that, he's in the place of the tombs. This is not a place that you would want to be, especially in the context of ancient Judaism with a concern for purity, not to mention the man himself. He is basically stripped of his humanity, at least before the exorcism. He is alone. He's considered impure. And this is exactly who Jesus has come to see. Everything in the culture and the religion of the time would have said that this man cannot approach God, cannot enter a temple, cannot even be in the community. And so what's amazing is that it's to this man that cannot approach God that God approaches. It's an incredible moment. It exemplifies some of the most intriguing parts of Mark's account. We see God doing something totally unexpected, crossing the sea to cast out demons out of somebody that society would have said that he shouldn't have had anything to do with. And he's given this unsuspecting man a new lease on life. And at the end of it all, here comes the crowd again. Here comes trouble. They witness this miracle and they are overcome with fear. Seeing him in his right mind, they beg him to leave and they drive him away. Why? I don't really know. I think that if I witnessed this, if somebody that was possessed was no longer, I don't think I would react that way. And so I think that's so interesting. And if anybody has any of their own thoughts on that, I'd love to hear it before we move on to the last passage.
Yeah, Wendy mentioned that she said, I would think that the demoniac was known to the people in the area. So this would have been an amazing sight to see this man healed.
Yep, exactly. I wonder what that says about when we witness something miraculous and we feel angry about it or fearful. Even the dog, the little golden retriever, seems to be afraid.
Yeah, where's he going?
Okay, shall we move on?
Hannah has a thought, but we can move on.
No, what's Hannah's thought?
Is she ready? I'm not sure yet. She has a thought.
Oh.
It might be coming. While she's typing, because I believe she's probably typing, I just want to tell you a couple of other things people just reflected on. What does it mean when Legion asks not to be sent out of the country, which is an interesting thought. And then Thomas says, why do the demons regularly recognize Jesus as the Son of God, but his own disciples do not?
Yes, exactly. Thomas gets it. That's exactly what's so weird.
Yeah.
But I think some of that is because all the gospel accounts, but Mark in particular, is an intensely spiritual world. It's.
Hannah says, people think they know, and Jesus shows them something completely different and surprising. People are used to what they're used to.
Yes.
And then Amy says, maybe the crowd is afraid of losing more livestock. Also,
very practical.
Valid concern.
Yeah.
Valid concern.
I mean, sure, especially at the time.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
Real quick, before we move on, the last comment I'll read. Constance says, humans will hang on to the familiar, even if it is uncomfortable, and the release thereof could be liberating. Scary only for those so moved.
I was thinking recently about how I think, for better or for worse, people tend to just choose the dysfunction that they're familiar with. And that's not always a good thing, especially not when Jesus is offering us a new way. Okay, so let's look at this last passage. I think I'm reading this one, but once again, you're welcome to share any reactions in the chat while I'm reading or once we start talking. So this is the 16th chapter. You'll probably recognize this. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, who will roll away the stone for us, the entrance to the tomb? When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back, and they entered the tomb. And as they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. So if you were to open your Bible, particularly if you have a study Bible, many of your copies would likely continue past what I've included here. If you have a study Bible, like I said, you would see a phrase marked as the shorter ending of Mark, and then that's where the women actually do tell the disciples what they've seen. And then if you looked a little bit farther, maybe an additional 10 verses or so, you would see something labeled the longer ending of Mark. And this is where Jesus appears to the disciples, commissions them to proclaim the good news, and then ascends to heaven. This kind of wraps everything up really neatly, the way that I think we'd like for it to. However, the oldest manuscripts stop where our passage does, with neither the so-called shorter or longer ending. Most of the oldest manuscripts stop right here, somewhat abruptly. So do we have any reactions to this? It's totally fine if not.
Looks like we might have a couple coming in. It's funny to hear this story because I think this story is so familiar to us, to think of new reactions. You know, it's you have to remind yourself that there's things that you probably didn't notice in the million times you've heard this passage read before, right?
Less than, well, just a week ago, notwithstanding.
Yes.
Should I just go ahead?
There's one question. It's interesting, and it's interesting to note. John says, "I've always wondered, why does a man in a white robe? Why is that listed? Deliver this message to Mary, and Salome."
That is interesting. My guess is that this person is probably supposed to be an angel. But a lot of times in the Bible, it's unclear whether it's supposed to be God or an angel. I'm thinking particularly about Jacob wrestling with a man, but then later the man is God. I think, if I'm remembering that. So most likely, John, it's an angel.
Another question, which I always find this one interesting. Why in verse 7 is Peter named separately from the other disciples? Was he off by himself? Why was he not with the others?
I haven't thought about this until this moment, but I almost wonder if that's part of that tradition that's largely discredited by scholars, that says that Mark was writing what Peter had told him. And so if that's, whether true or not, a tradition that occurs in Mark, I wonder if that's kind of Peter's special call out.
That is interesting. And also, you know, it would be interesting to note, you know, that when Peter is considered the rock on which the church has been built, that this would be an important point for him to have been involved.
Yes.
In that. Hannah says, this is a clear instance of the go tell this. There's no secrecy here.
Yes. And so here's an example of where it's very clear. Go tell this. Except if we kind of just cut it off here, where the oldest manuscripts end, they don't. It's like, this is your all clear. This is your collect $100 and, you know, pass go, and they don't. Instead, once again, having witnessed a miracle, and kind of like the biggest miracle of them all, resurrection of, you know, Jesus, they respond in fear. And what I'm struck by is, if we're thinking about this as an Easter text, which of course it is fear something that we usually associate with Easter morning? And so then I wonder, well, what are they afraid of? And kind of thinking about some of the things we've already discussed, I wonder if they're afraid of being ridiculed. Would you likely believe somebody who told you that they knew that somebody had been raised from the dead? Maybe they're afraid of rejection. We've already seen several times how the crowd rejects the testimonies of the miraculous and drives people away just for taking part in them. I even wonder if they're for some reason afraid of Jesus. If there's any shame in seeing Jesus after the women didn't so much, but the disciples deserted him. Is there something fearful about resurrection? But I do think it's fairly realistic. I think that if you were to picture yourself there on that first Easter, and if you were honest, you might be at least a little bit scared. I think this is where we really have to ask ourselves, are we paying attention to the text, or do we already know what it's going to say and we're already comfortable with what we think that it means? Because isn't the idea of a man raising from the dead at least slightly unnerving? or are we just completely numb to what resurrection means because we're Christian and because we celebrate Easter? But I think if you're not satisfied with this ending, this being cut off, you wouldn't be alone. Scholars wonder if that's why later copies of this gospel, later manuscripts, tend to include so much more action, that shorter ending and the longer ending that I mentioned, because there is something disquieting, I think, about the women's response in fear, how they don't say anything, or how, this is their chance and they don't tell anyone. They have the knowledge, and that's something we've talked about a lot, is who has the knowledge and what do they do with the knowledge. And this is one of the moments in the gospel where they have all of it. They have in a sense, they have the complete picture, and it seems they just keep it to themselves. Or perhaps this sudden stop, the silence of the women, creates a space for a response in you. In reading this, do you want to, as the senior pastor Scott invited us in his sermon last Sunday, do you want to run to Galilee and finish the story? Does the ending in Mark allow you to add your own story of faith to this account of resurrection? I think either way, at the end of the day, this is how the oldest versions of Mark's account ends. But no matter what, it's not the end of the story, because it never was Mark's story in the first place. It never was Mark's gospel, just his account. And so it's what I've been saying all along. This is the gospel of Jesus Christ according to Mark. Jamie, you've just muted, but that is, unless there are any further reactions specific to this passage, that is what I have for you.
All right.
Besides this beautiful image from the Lindisfarne Gospels of Mark with a lion, which represents Mark.
Thank you so much, Morgan. We have about 8 minutes for you to, at the bottom, you can either put it in the chat or you can put it in the Q&A, which is at the bottom of your screen. Oh, there's one already in there. Any questions that you have? I'll go ahead and start with this first one in the Q&A, Morgan. I know you can see that as well, so I'll read it out loud. The structure of Mark is very strange. The first 10 chapters consist of terse, almost staccato passages of Jesus's actions, often casting out demons and healing people, interspersed with lengthy passages of Jesus recounting parables. There is almost exegesis compared John. Then the last 6 chapters are devoted to the Last Supper and Passion. What are your thoughts about this structure? To me, it suggests that Mark may have had more than one author.
Well, I certainly think that's possible. Is there a way for me to read these questions, Jamie?
Yes, yes. At the bottom, I know that's a lot. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A, and this is for everyone else as well. You'll see something that says Q&A on the bottom of your screen, Morgan. Mm-hmm. Do you see that?
Oh yes. Okay.
There's the question right there. I know that was a long one. Thank you, Thomas. And he clarified almost no exegesis.
There's almost no exegesis. Okay. So I think it's entirely possible that there would have been multiple authors of Mark. I don't remember reading that in this most recent journey of research and discovery. But one thing that does make me think of in the way that Thomas has described the structure of Mark is I know that a lot of the commentaries mentioned that because Mark's biggest source was the witness of the Christian community at the time that I kind of talked about at the beginning, that and I think this ties into as well, why is Mark's gospel the shortest? There's this idea that Mark had certain assumptions about what his audience already knew. And so I think the terseness and kind of the lack of exegesis is because Mark thought that the audience had the skeletal framework of what they needed to believe in terms of faith, and just kind of included what he thought they didn't already know or what was unclear to them. So that doesn't exactly answer Thomas's question, but I think that does speak a little bit to its structure. because I think as the shortest gospel, Mark's just thinking, well, this is fairly recent. You all already know this, so I'm not going to include it. I'm not going to, go over that again.
Sorry, in my earlier clarification, it was that Morgan could see the questions. I'm sorry, it doesn't mean that everyone can, but everyone can ask a question using that Q&A there at the bottom. Someone had wondered about, in that passage we were reading about Easter, this that they specified that the angel was sitting on the right hand, or the person in white was sitting on the right hand, and just kind of wondering if that was used because we often hear about Jesus on the right hand of God.
I think that they answered their own question. I don't know anything beyond that was when you started the question. That's immediately where my mind went. Is that it's a theme. What's the word? Is it a trope? Maybe.
That sounds good.
Yeah. Is that what I'm thinking of? No, it's not. Tropes and anyway.
Another question.
Motifs. Yes. Thank you, Jane.
There you go.
I can always count on you.
Another question. Why does Mark just jump into when Jesus is an adult and not tell the story of his birth or childhood?
Next time I do anything like this, I'm going to ask for all the questions in advance. I do not like this live questions. I feel totally unprepared. So this is kind of off the top of my head, but I wonder if the reason why Mark doesn't have kind of that typical Advent Christmassy stuff has to do with what we talked about earlier with the Synoptic Gospels. I can pull up that image again really quickly if I can get to it. 1 second. Okay, so I wonder, Jamie, can you see it?
Yep.
Okay. Oops. So I wonder if the Christmas tradition or the stories and the information that gave the gospel writers access to those ideas, I wonder if that is this down here, the shared tradition between Luke and Matthew.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, because I think that's where we get most of those Advent scriptures. And so I wonder if that's whatever source that Luke and Matthew had access to that Mark did not have access to. I wonder if that's where Christmas comes from.
Just a thought. Once again, I'm just bouncing off this question as well. The idea that that Mark may possibly have been a Gentile and not had that Jewish background, that the lineage of Jesus may not have been as important to his story, maybe as it was to others who were telling that story. I wonder, just an idea.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, and it kind of goes along with I think something that I don't know if I can ask my own question and answer it. But I did want to say something else about some of the unique content in Mark, because I think somebody asked about that maybe like in the middle, so I wanted to come back to it. One of the things that's unique in Mark, part of that 3% of content, is Mark tends to explain the Jewish customs at the time. So where he, going back to Thomas's question, where in certain places Mark makes assumptions about what his audience knows, for whatever reason, he's assuming that they don't understand basic, elements of ancient Jewish practice. So we see that where Mark explains certain customs, things like diet, washing food, washing utensils. Some of the other parts of the 3% was, and I mentioned this, but I just kind of want to highlight it, is the fact that Jesus's family thought that he was losing his mind. And I think this is really interesting because for a couple of reasons. One is, I wonder if we've all had moments when it felt like the people that supposedly knew us best, our family, our loved ones, when it felt like they second guessed us or questioned us or discounted us when we're actually doing exactly what we need to be doing and we're exactly where we need to be. And so I think that presents a really relatable kind of image of Jesus's experience as a human. Couple other things. Mark, going back to our passage with the demoniac, Mark is the only one that counts the number of the possessed pigs in our story. So I think it was Amy who brought up the concerns around livestock. Mark says that there were 2,000 swine, and it's the only one that does that.
Good to know. It's good to know. Well, we are officially out of time. So thank you all for your fantastic questions, and particularly thank you, Morgan, for giving us a brief introduction to Mark. Fortunately, you all are home, I hope, so you can just dive right into reading it tonight. You don't even have to go home and start reading it. And do keep in mind the things Morgan said. One great thing is this is being recorded, and it will be up on our YouTube page, not tomorrow, but soon it will be up there. So if you need to reflect back on what Morgan said about anything, you are welcome to do that, or look at what he said about the crowds or the demon possessions. You are welcome to do that. Next Sunday evening, we will be joined by Reverend Kate Dunn, who will be talking to us about the Gospel of Matthew. I hope that you are all able to join us. If you have already registered for that one, you will be receiving an email on that day with the link. If you don't get it, feel free to email me and just let me know. But if you haven't registered for that yet, I would encourage you to, because we're going to be going through all 4 of these Gospels, and I think it's a great way to kind of get that whole picture of Jesus's life. So again, thank you everyone who joined us from all over the country, and particularly thank you to Morgan for tonight.
Thank you, everybody.
All right, everyone have a good night. Bye-bye.